plagues without a trace, missing commandments, two different origins of the earth itself. For all its complexity, some stories in the Bible just don't add up. Stay tuned to learn more. The New Testament begins with the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew shares stories in common with all subsequent Gospels, so it might be reasonable to assume it was written earliest. Well, biblical scholars tend to disagree. They overwhelmingly attribute first dibs to Mark, who leaves a little to be desired as far as concluding the resurrection tale. In the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, Jesus' tomb is visited by women who want to tend to his corpse. However, in the place of a body, they find shining angels, or men in, quote, dazzling apparel. Filled with joy and fear, they run to tell the disciples of Jesus. Jesus himself wastes no time in making an appearance either, reassuring the women and letting them in on his upcoming travel plans. Mark's story, however, ends with a cut-to-black moment that would make Inception jealous. The women arrive at the heavy tombstone, which they have been fretting about moving themselves, only to find it already rolled aside. A young man inside the tomb calmly tells them that Jesus has risen and is on his way to Galilee, that they shouldn't be afraid, and that they should inform the disciples of what they saw. Unfortunately for that guy, they don't tell the disciples, and they definitely don't rejoice. They flee, terrified out of their minds, and tell no one, and then the gospel ends.
Mind if I chill here? I feel like people avoid me because I'm God's son or whatever, but I'm actually like a pretty laid-back guy.
If Mark is the earliest gospel, maybe we can assume the rest of the authors saw his version and opted to take a more comforting approach. But the question remains as to how the resurrection aftermath really went down. The death of Jesus is a harrowing story. Betrayed by his own disciple and sentenced to an agonizing death by crucifixion, it is held by Christians as the ultimate sacrifice. But when did it actually happen? Considering all we know, who betrayed him, who sentenced him, that it all went down over Passover, it's surprising that biblical accounts still disagree on what day Jesus died. Jesus' death takes place in Jerusalem, which gives us a clue. According to Bart Ehrman and his book Jesus Interrupted, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible, Jerusalem celebrated Passover on one specific day, with no allowances for different Jewish denominations. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is crucified at 9 in the morning on the day of Passover, and dies at noon the same day. The previous day, called the Day of Preparation, he shared a Passover meal with his disciples before his arrest by the Roman authorities. However, the Gospel of John winds the clock back about one full day. Jesus is sentenced to crucifixion by Pontius Pilate at noon on the Day of Preparation, making it the day of, well, everything. It's another classic case of he said in the Gospel. The Son of God had a human father figure in Joseph. The Bible is not super clear, however, on who Joseph's father is. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke offer genealogies of Jesus, both starting with Joseph, but differing in the next generation.
And not just from us, from our fathers, and from our fathers' fathers.
And from our fathers' fathers' fathers.
Yeah.
And from our fathers' 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 fathers.
In Matthew, we are told that Jacob is Joseph's father, but in Luke, it's said to be Heli. So why does this matter? As stated by Bart Ehrman in Jesus Interrupted, the Messiah is to be the son of David, a descendant of Israel's greatest king. So the Gospels of Matthew and Luke must go through the trouble of identifying Jesus' royal blood by documenting Joseph's ancestors all the way to King David. They both go even further, with Matthew ending at Abraham and Luke taking it all the way back to Adam. One potential explanation of the difference in Jesus' grandfather's name is the idea that the genealogy in Matthew relates to Joseph, while Luke's genealogy could be from Mary's line. But even this is still widely contested. Bart Ehrman notes, "It is an attractive solution, but it has a fatal flaw. Luke explicitly indicates that the family line is that of Joseph, not Mary." The Bible tells us that 10 commandments were delivered to Moses and the Israelites, seared into stone by God's own hand, with instructions such as you shall not murder, you shall not steal, and none of those adultery shenanigans either. These commandments are pretty iconic. In fact, they're just about everywhere in the modern world. That said, the Bible ventures into some unfamiliar territory with additional laws handed down to Moses. For starters, the Bible contains more than one version of the commandments, with 2 full sets and 2 partial sets. Then in Exodus 20, there are arguably 13 statements from which we derive the commandments.
These 15! Wait. 10 commandments!
This might seem like splitting hairs until we consider the commandments that Moses is given on the second try in 2 brand spanking new stone tablets. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. And do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Way different, right? It's a totally separate tone and purpose from the previous set of laws. And according to Oxford Biblical Studies Online, biblical scholars are not even sure whether the term 10 Commandments refers to what is written in Exodus 20, Exodus 34, or Deuteronomy 5. The creation of all existence is described in two very neat itemized lists, one in Genesis 1 and the other in Genesis 2, with completely different sequences of events. Why include two origin stories that don't align? Utah State University professor David Bakaboy comments, "It is likely that separate authors with distinct theological views and agendas wrote these myths. In the first account of creation, Genesis 1, we kick off with the heavens and the earth, followed by light and darkness on the first day. On day 2, we get the sky. Day 3, plants arrive. The sun and moon pop into existence on day 4, and fish and birds appear on the 5th day. It isn't until the 6th day that God creates man and woman, along with land-dwelling animals, before taking the 7th day off to relax. In Genesis 2, the script is flipped to prioritize humanity. We start with a barren earth, no plants or water. From its dust, the first man, Adam, is created. God then causes plants and trees to grow in the Garden of Eden, places Adam there, and encourages him to work the land. Seeing Adam could use some help, God presents him with all manner of newly created animals, which Adam is in charge of naming. Eventually, God creates the first woman, Eve, from Adam's rib, for the purpose of curing his loneliness. Abraham holds a central role in the Old Testament as the first patriarch of the Hebrews. He is venerated in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. According to the book of Genesis, Abraham begins his dynasty-building journey in Ur of the Chaldeans, and while no actual dates are given, this happens at approximately 2000 BCE in the biblical timeline. Many know Ur as the ancient city of Sumer and Babylonia, which very much did exist from as early as 4000 BCE, but the specific reference to the Chaldeans throws a wrench in the works. The Chaldeans are not even mentioned in historical records until over 1,000 years later per Britannica. The Chaldeans are first referenced during the reign of Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, somewhere between 883 BCE and 859 BCE. However, their rule of Ur would not commence until 721 BCE, well after the time of Abraham. So even if the city of Ur of the Chaldeans was not the same Ur we associate with the Sumerians and Babylonians, there is still a vast gulf of time separating Abraham from his biblical birthplace. The animals came in 2 by 2, or 7 by 2, depending on which biblical account of Noah's flood you read. Here's what we know about the story for sure. After God deems humanity too wicked to continue, a great flood is sent to drown the earth. As the only good man left, Noah gets to take his family and a multitude of animals to ride out the flood in a giant wooden boat, with the purpose of repopulating the planet later.
Oh, and you might need this.
So far, so good, but the Bible waffles on God's specifications for the animals. For example, in one chapter of Genesis, Noah is instructed to bring aboard the ark 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground. This is the clearest cut version, likely the one most are familiar with. But in another chapter of Genesis, the requirement shifts somewhat to 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. The length of the flood is also unclear, described as lasting either 40 days or 150 days. Biblical students have suggested these contradictions are simply different parts of the same narrative. According to Jeffrey Gagan from the Bishop School, they are most likely 2 different traditions that were later brought together. There is a rare commonality between the 4 Gospels and the reaction to Jesus' resurrection by his disciples: surprise and doubt. Granted, it comes to them as a very pleasant and joyful surprise, but why is it a surprise at all? On several occasions prior to his death, Jesus made explicitly clear that he was not only going to be killed, but brought back to life. In the Gospel of Mark alone, Jesus tells his disciples exactly what's going down 3 separate times. That seems like fair warning, right? Well, Apostle Thomas still feels the need to stick his fingers in Jesus' wounds to be convinced that it really is him. And this is after Jesus performed numerous miracles in front of all the disciples, such as walking on the water, controlling the weather, and raising the actual dead. At that point, just give JC a break and keep your hands to yourself, Thomas. During the reign of Augustus, a census was called across the Roman Empire that required all subjects to return to their familial lands to be counted. As we've discussed, Joseph was said to be descended from the house of King David, and was thus required to travel with his pregnant wife Mary from Nazareth to his hometown of Bethlehem. Along the way, they were guided by a star, and eventually found their way to a stable where Jesus was born. But there's a snag between this heartwarming tale and historical records. The reign of Augustus Caesar is well documented, but there is no recorded evidence of an empire-spanning census during this period. Bart Ehrman of Jesus Interrupted notes that it would probably be far too impractical to make everyone in the Roman Empire return to their ancestral home, something they may only be connected to by 1,000-year-old roots. A census did take place in the region where Jesus was born, Judea, ordered by the Roman governor of Syria, Quirinius, after 6 AD. But as described in the census and Quirinius, this was 10 years after the villain of the Nativity story, King Herod, died in 4 BCE. The city of Jericho, located in today's West Bank, is truly ancient, with its origins as a permanent settlement dating back almost 11,000 years, according to Britannica. Its famous walls appeared almost as long ago, with evidence of thick fortifications dating back to 8000 BCE. These are the walls that were supposedly destroyed by Joshua and his Israelite army. In the Old Testament book of Joshua, the Israelites parade silently around Jericho, a city promised to them by God, for 6 days. On the 7th day, they blast trumpets and shout so loudly that the walls tumble, permitting the army to sack the city. As described by Mara Sala in Bible Odyssey, estimates for when Joshua conducted this campaign are towards the end of the 13th century BCE, as the Bronze Age was drawing to a close. Archaeological digs over the 20th century reveal a different story. The destruction layers found at Jericho, layers of soot and burnt masonry, indicate the city had definitely faced disaster more than once. However, not since around 1550 BCE had these famous walls been rebuilt, which was long before Joshua and his rowdy army were said to have arrived. In the book of Exodus, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity to the Promised Land, but not before some serious arm twisting. Moses needed God to bring 10 awful plagues upon the people of Egypt before the Pharaoh relented and set the Israelites free. The plagues included rivers of blood, frogs, flies, hail, and eventually the divine slaughter of every Egyptian firstborn son. The enormity of these plagues and the socio-economic impact of losing an entire tribe's free labor may have been worthy of documentation by the Egyptians, right? Not so much. According to National Geographic, there is no evidence from written Egyptian records that the plagues, or the Exodus itself for that matter, ever took place. There are some tantalizing scraps of contemporary records supporting a Semitic presence in Egypt around the 13th century BCE, per the Biblical Archaeology Society. It's also true that the Egyptians were not in the habit of recording their calamities or defeats. So while scholars are still divided on whether there was an Exodus, the matter of why the Egyptians didn't mention the 10 plagues remains a mystery.